Well, it's time for another lecture. Today we'll cover the Nixon years and Jimmy Carter's presidency, essentially politics during the 1970s. There are a few topics to address in this presentation. First of all, we'll explore Richard Nixon's domestic policy and his foreign policy triumphs. Most people have heard of the Watergate scandal, but he actually had some successes in other areas. But we'll also give a blow-by-blow of some of the events associated with that scandal that brought down his administration. Next, we'll explore the highlights of Jimmy Carter's presidency. There are a few things that you want to consider. First of all, was the legacy of Richard Nixon's presidency positive or negative for the nation? Secondly, by 1980, was the United States becoming a second-rate world power? We'll start next with a bit of background to Richard Nixon and his domestic policy successes. Richard Nixon was one of the best-known American politicians as early as the 1950s. This was primarily because he had served as vice president under the popular Dwight Eisenhower. He came from California, and while his family wasn't rich, he did come from a modest background. His early reputation was that of a conservative Republican. Some thought that his political career had ended when he lost the presidential election of 1960 to John F. Kennedy, but he just stepped into the background for a short time. In many ways, Nixon was most known for his strong anti-communist views. These were shown as his actions when he was vice president, but also prior to that when he was a member of Congress. When Nixon was a member of Congress, he helped to uncover a communist spy ring that was nicknamed the Pumpkin Papers because materials were spread from one spy to another inside of hollowed-out pumpkins. On the right, you see an image of a very young Richard Nixon. Nixon returned to politics on an active basis by the late 1960s, and he ran for president in 1968, running on the message of a return to law and order. Expanded interest in the environment was sparked by the publication of Silent Spring in 1962. On the right, you see an image of Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring. She was a former researcher for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Her book outlined the dangers of pesticide use and how chemicals such as DDT impacted plant and animal life as well as human beings. The growing interest in environmental issues is probably best seen when 20 million Americans celebrated the first Earth Day in 1970. Richard Nixon was influenced by many of this renewed interest in the environment. While Nixon didn't agree with all of the suggestions of environmentalists during his administration, we do see several pieces of environmental legislation put into place. First of all, the Environmental Protection Agency was created by Congress in 1971. This was designed to oversee the new regulations and restrictions mandated by Congress. High water quality standards were established to protect drinking water, as well as additional regulations to protect marine life and coastlines. The auto industry also faced new regulations when a ceiling was placed on levels of pollutant emissions cars were allowed to put into the air. Nixon's domestic policy was also influenced by some road bumps dealing with the U.S. economy. Spending on the Vietnam War, followed by the Great Society's spending, took a toll on the U.S. economy as seen with this chart outlining rising rates of inflation. Nixon responded by trying to be active. He cut spending and raised interest rates. The result was the first recession since Eisenhower was in office. Next, he tried deficit spending to try to stimulate the economy. This resulted in a huge budget deficit. He also tried establishing wage and price controls, which helped for a short time. But in the long run, inflation continued and deficits increased. Nixon was a Republican, and a conservative at that. With another Republican in the White House, some wondered if he would try to dismantle Johnson's Great Society. Nixon surprised many with his support for what came to be known as the Family Assistance Plan. This is a slide from a previous presentation. Remember that Great Society that Lyndon Johnson had championed? Well, many wondered, would Richard Nixon try to overhaul this or eliminate it? We'll see. The Family Assistance Plan was Nixon's plan to overhaul Johnson's Great Society and, as he put it, to end welfare as they knew it in 1970. It actually wasn't as conservative as many thought because it would guarantee a family of four an income of $1,600 a year. This was significant because $1,600 a year was a lot more than most state welfare agencies were paying at the time. At the same time, the heads of households would receive money and that received the money were required to enroll in job training. Essentially, this was designed to provide short-term assistance with money with the long-term goal of getting people off of welfare with required job training. Nixon championed this. However, it failed to pass Congress. Even though it failed, it demonstrated Nixon's centrist approach to domestic politics rather than a deeply conservative one. Let's explore Nixon's foreign policy next. Probably Nixon's greatest successes of his administration came in American foreign policy. His chief deputy, shown here, helped him carry out many of these policies. He was a former refugee from Hitler's Germany who was also a well-respected professor of international relations. This deputy was Henry Kissinger. Over the next several years, Kissinger would hold a variety of different positions within the Nixon White House. The new policy adopted by Nixon and Kissinger was called détente. Kind of a one-sentence definition is shown here. This policy would lead to closer and more positive relations between the United States and communist countries. It's best seen with U.S. policies geared toward China and the Soviet Union. Since 1949, the United States had not even recognized the communist government in China. In 1949, there was a revolution in China and communists took over. The U.S. didn't even recognize that government. Relations were so bad between the United States and China, Chinese Americans who had been born in China were prohibited from traveling back to China to go visit relatives. Under Nixon, the United States began a process to normalize relations or to recognize China's communist government, in a major symbolic gesture demonstrating this shift in policy. In February 1972, Nixon traveled to China, where, among other things, he met with a range of Chinese leaders. That previous slide showed Nixon with Chairman Mao from China. Here, we see Nixon visiting the Great Wall of China. Détente was also seen with the Soviet Union. This first began with a visit by Nixon to Russia in the summer of 1972. Here we see an image of President Nixon with Soviet Chairman Leonid Brezhnev. Two additional agreements also helped to demonstrate the tangible results of détente. First, the United States sold 400 million tons of grain to the Soviets at below market prices. This made the Soviets happy, but it also helped American farmers because they found a new market for their goods. We also see SALT. This stood for Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. For the first time, the Americans and Soviets agreed to place limits on the number of offensive nuclear weapons for each country. On the left, we see that original definition of détente. Now, I'd like to offer some analysis. Overall, it was a tremendous success for Nixon. The key strength of Nixon and Kissinger was that they recognized there was a split between the Chinese and Russian communists. They used this to split the two and to play those two nations off against one another. Who else could have accomplished this? Possibly no one other than Richard Nixon himself, because he had an impeccable record as an anti-communist. Others probably would have been labeled as too soft on communism. It demonstrated that Nixon was a true statesman and successful diplomat. Next, we'll explore a series of events that eventually brought down the Nixon presidency. These generally are often labeled as the Watergate scandal. We'll begin with some background first. To provide a bit of background to Watergate, I'd like to begin by defining some terms. The first of these terms would be CREEP. This stood for Committee to Re-elect the President. Now, there's nothing sinister at all in creating such a committee, but it turns out that CREEP was involved in several illegal activities. Many of these come under the label of dirty tricks in order to try to help Nixon win his re-election. There were a range of dirty tricks employed by the Nixon administration. Some were not illegal. They just involved maybe some fake mailings and letters to try to pit Democrats against one another. Sometimes they would encourage hecklers to go to events that were sponsored by the Democrats. But there were also illegal activities that were undertaken as well. The IRS was used to investigate enemies of Richard Nixon. Another of those illegal activities undertaken by the Nixon re-election campaign involved breaking into different areas in order to get dirt on Nixon's opponents. The reason why the scandal is called the Watergate scandal is that in the summer of 1972, several people employed by the Nixon re-election campaign broke into the Democratic headquarters located in the Watergate office and hotel complex in Washington, D.C. They were caught in an attempt as they were trying to discover what the Democrat strategy was for the upcoming election. Those involved in the break-in, well, they were trying to place bugs at different parts of the Watergate offices of the Democratic Party in order to get dirt on the Democrats. Now, Nixon probably didn't know specifically about the plans for the break-in ahead of time, but once he found out, he did not go public. Instead, he tried to cover up the links between his people who were arrested and his campaign. He also interfered with the FBI's investigation of those who were arrested. So why did he do this? Well, if you remember, Richard Nixon lost a very close election to John F. Kennedy in 1960, and he vowed he would never lose a close election like that ever again. Now, there were a lot of people who deserve credit for investigating the break-in and putting the pieces together in the whole Watergate scandal. Two of those individuals were Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They're shown here. They were reporters for the Washington Post. These two writers were helped by an anonymous source nicknamed Deep Throat. This mysterious source gave clues to Woodward and Bernstein over time. Now, they nicknamed this source Deep Throat after an adult film that was popular in the 1970s, in part because this mysterious source that Woodward had would often want to only meet at night and in parking garages. For over 30 years, we did not know the true identity of Deep Throat. But in the summer of 2005, we learned it was Mark Felt. He came forward and admitted he was the mystery man. In the 1970s, he was a top official at the FBI, and he had first-hand knowledge of Nixon's activities. As members of Congress began to investigate the scandal, it was discovered that a taping system had been installed at the White House. Eventually, Nixon had to give up those tapes, and prosecutors acquired access to them. The image on the left shows part of that taping system at the White House. On the right, we see a political cartoon, because one of the most crucial tapes included a mysterious 18-minute gap. Even though it had this gap, the tapes clearly showed that the president was involved in some sort of a cover-up. Those tapes showed that Nixon had obstructed justice, an impeachable offense. As he was facing impeachment and removal from office, he was approached by many people suggesting that he should resign. Several years ago, I visited the George H.W. Bush Library and Museum. In the 1970s, when Nixon was in office, George H.W. Bush was chairman of the Republican Party. Here we see a handwritten note from Mr. Bush, where he says, "It is my considered judgment that you should now resign." It was amazing seeing this handwritten note. Bush had no idea about the activities that Nixon had undertaken, and he was devastated by Nixon's actions. Eventually, as this letter shows, he turned on him because he realized that Nixon had broken the law. On the left, we see a headline from the New York Post. Nixon announced that he would resign at noon, August 9, 1974. On the right, we see Nixon's farewell to the country as he entered a helicopter and left the White House grounds. Once Nixon's resignation took effect, Gerald Ford became the new president, in a move that surprised many. In September of 1974, Gerald Ford issued a pardon of former President Nixon for any and all crimes he may have committed while in office. So, how do we explore Nixon's legacy? Well, first of all, he had tremendous foresight in foreign affairs. He demonstrated he was a true statesman by overlooking his past views concerning communism and establishing an entirely new outlook in foreign affairs. But maybe the most lasting legacy was his actions shattered trust between politicians and the American people. Those tapes and subsequent investigations revealed that the Watergate break-in was just one in a series of abuses of power by the Nixon White House. Among other things, an enemies list had been developed by Nixon. It was also revealed that the administration used government agencies to harass opponents. Tapes also showed that the president had a drinking problem, and he used racial slurs quite often in the Oval Office directed toward African Americans and those of Jewish ancestry. Many Americans began to wonder, after the loss in Vietnam and the U.S. economy not doing so great, was the United States becoming a second-rate world power now that its president had been forced to resign too? Well, next we'll explore the presidency of Jimmy Carter. He was elected to the White House in 1976 and served for 4 years, beginning in 1977. It was in the backdrop of the Watergate scandal that a Washington outsider, Jimmy Carter, became president in 1977. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy and had served on nuclear submarines. He then returned home to Plains, Georgia, to farm and was later elected governor. He was an attractive candidate who pledged to never lie to the American people and described himself as a born-again Christian. Several years ago, I was lucky enough to visit the boyhood home of Jimmy Carter in Plains, Georgia. Here we see it, and for several years there was no running water at this house. There was no electricity until Carter was 14 years old. Here we see me on Main Street in Plains, Georgia from a few years ago. They love Jimmy Carter today. He clearly was a hometown boy, as you can see with the population being 553 in the 2020 census. It was a small town when he grew up, and it continues to be a small town today. In the upper right, you see the presidential campaign headquarters located in an old railroad depot. The high point of Carter's presidency probably came when he successfully forged a peace agreement in the Middle East. This came to be known as the Camp David Accords, and let me start with some background. During the Second World War, over 6 million Jews died. Well, in the years immediately after the Second World War, in order to prevent this from happening again, Jews were guaranteed a homeland in Israel. In 1948, Israel declared its independence. Arab nations protested because many Palestinians had lived in those areas that the newly formed Israel had in its boundaries. This led to the first Arab-Israeli War. Then, in 1967, we had the Six-Day War. In 6 days, Israel captured the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, and West Bank. In 1973, we saw the Arab-Israeli War. Egypt and Syria attacked territories controlled by Israel as a result of the Six-Day War. Initially, those attacks were successful, but then Israel regained control over those territories. After decades of conflict, Carter hoped to bring peace to the region, so he called upon the leaders of both Egypt and Israel to meet at the president's retreat, Camp David. The result was the Camp David Accords. In this agreement, Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel's government. In return, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. It was hoped that this agreement between Israel and a Muslim nation would help lay the foundation for future peace in the entire region. Next, we'll explore some of the crises or troubles experienced during the Carter administration. One of the troubles facing the nation in the 1970s was an energy crisis. As you can see from this chart, beginning in the 1970s, the price of gasoline skyrocketed. Now, I don't know about you, I wouldn't mind paying $1 for a gallon of gas, but the price of gasoline in 1970 averaged about 35 cents a gallon. It tripled by 1979. On the right, you see this spike in gasoline prices in the chart on the top. On the bottom, the price of gasoline also was raised because of the conflict in the Middle East, and gas had to be rationed in some parts of the country. Look at the line of cars trying to wait so that they could get gasoline and pay for it at a higher price than they were normally paying in the past. Those increased gas prices had an impact on inflation. I had previously talked about the problems with inflation linked to Richard Nixon's policies. Well, the problems continued after he left office. When Carter ran for election in 1976, he talked about the so-called misery index. And what he did was he said this is the level of inflation plus unemployment. Well, you can see when he ran for president in 1976, he argued that misery index was unacceptable with the inflation rate at 6% and unemployment at 8%. Well, by 1980, the figures were even worse. Inflation had more than doubled and unemployment remained high. Americans began to question, was the United States becoming a second-rate world power with its economy floundering like this? Economic woes were followed by a foreign policy crisis with Iran in 1979. From the early 1950s onward, the United States had supported the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, as the nation's leader because he supported the United States in the Middle East. However, he was an unpopular and repressive leader. In 1979, a revolution replaced the Shah with a religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini preached hatred of the United States and declared the United States was the Great Satan. During this revolution in November of 1979, 53 Americans were taken hostage in Iran. The following April, a rescue attempt failed, leaving 8 servicemen dead. I don't know if you've ever visited Arlington National Cemetery, but a monument is there for the servicemen who died attempting to rescue those hostages. We see images of that here. Eventually, those hostages were released, but they had been imprisoned for nearly 450 days, and they were not released until Carter left office in 1981. Many began to question the leadership of Carter in a crisis, and some began to continue to wonder, with all of these things happening in the United States in the decade of the 1970s and early 80s, was the United States becoming a second-rate world power? Well, I'd like to end with some final thoughts and a bit of a wrap-up of the key ideas of today's presentation. Well, today we discussed 2 presidential administrations. We explored the successes and failures of the Nixon administration. We also looked at the presidency of Jimmy Carter. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to evaluate the legacy of Nixon's presidency. Overall, was it positive or negative for the nation? Also, you might want to be able to trace some of the factors that led some people to believe the United States was becoming a second-rate world power. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you online. All right.